There are moments in life when something happens, and you don't understand why. A door closes that you were certain would open. An opportunity disappears right when you thought everything was finally moving forward. A relationship ends in a way that leaves more questions than answers. Or you find yourself stuck in a season that feels repetitive, slow, and strangely unimportant. You wake up, go through the same routine, handle the same responsibilities, and wonder quietly to yourself, what is the point of this season of my life? Sometimes it feels like you're learning lessons that don't seem connected to anything meaningful. Maybe you're working a job that feels far below your potential. Maybe you're facing challenges that seem unnecessary. Maybe you're going through experiences that feel like detours instead of progress. And in those moments, it's natural to ask, why would God allow this? Because when life feels difficult or confusing, we often assume something has gone wrong. We think we made the wrong choice. We think we missed the right opportunity. Or we wonder if somehow we've fallen behind everyone else. But what if the experiences that feel random right now are actually preparation? What if the skills you're developing today are meant for a moment that hasn't arrived yet? What if the lessons you're learning today are answers to problems you haven't even faced yet? One of the most fascinating patterns in life is that many of the things that shape our future don't make sense while we're experiencing them. Only later do they connect. Only later do we look back and realize that what felt like a delay was actually preparation. What felt like frustration was actually training. And what felt like an unnecessary struggle became one of the most valuable lessons we ever learned. Think about how many times in life something difficult happened, and only years later did you realize it prepared you for something important. Maybe a job taught you a skill you didn't realize you would need later. Maybe a failure taught you wisdom that saved you from a bigger mistake in the future. Maybe a season of loneliness helped you discover strength you didn't know you had. At the time, none of it made sense. But later, the pieces connected. This is something that appears again and again in spiritual history as well. When we read about the lives of great biblical figures, we often focus on the moments of victory, the leadership, the miracles, the influence. But what we sometimes overlook are the years of preparation that came before those moments. Years where nothing seemed extraordinary. Years where life probably felt confusing, slow, or even discouraging. Take the life of Joseph. Joseph once had dreams that revealed a future of leadership and influence. But his journey toward that future did not begin with success. It began with betrayal. His own brothers sold him into slavery. Later, he was falsely accused and thrown into prison. From the outside, it looked like Joseph's life was falling apart. It looked like his dreams had been completely destroyed. But those painful years were quietly teaching him something. They were teaching him leadership, wisdom, patience, and the ability to manage responsibility even in difficult circumstances. Years later, when Joseph was suddenly placed in a position of power, those lessons became the very skills that allowed him to lead wisely. Without those earlier experiences, he might not have been prepared for the responsibility that came later. The same pattern appears in the life of Moses. Before Moses ever led an entire nation out of slavery, he spent 40 years living quietly in the wilderness. 40 years. No crowds. No leadership position. No visible influence. Just years of what likely felt like an ordinary life. But during those years, Moses was learning patience. He was learning humility. He was learning how to depend on God rather than his own strength. Those lessons became essential when he eventually stepped into the role he was meant to fulfill. And even the life of Jesus Christ followed this same pattern. Before his public ministry began, Jesus spent many years living quietly. Scripture records very little about those early years. No large crowds. No public miracles. No global influence. Just a hidden season. A season of preparation. When we read these stories today, we see the full picture. We see how every experience eventually connected. But while those individuals were living through those moments, they likely did not see the entire plan either. And the same may be true for you. There may be things happening in your life right now that seem small. Things that feel frustrating. Things that seem unrelated to the future you imagine for yourself. But what if those experiences are teaching you something? What if the challenges you face today are building strength you will rely on tomorrow? What if the lessons you are learning right now are answers to situations you haven't even encountered yet? Because one of the most powerful truths about the way God works is this. He often prepares the person before revealing the purpose. He teaches the lesson before the test appears. He builds the strength before the responsibility arrives. And that means something important. It means that even the seasons of life that feel slow or confusing may actually be filled with meaning. You may be learning something right now, something that will only make sense later. And when the moment finally comes where you need that lesson, you may suddenly realize that nothing you went through was ever wasted. One of the most surprising truths about life is this. Some of the most important preparation for your future will not look like preparation at all. It will look ordinary. It will look small. It will look like the kind of season that feels easy to overlook. You might wake up each day and follow a routine that feels repetitive. You go to work. You handle responsibilities. You deal with challenges that seem disconnected from the future you imagine for yourself. And because nothing dramatic appears to be happening, you begin to wonder if you are standing still. But the reality is that many of the most important skills people develop are learned in seasons that feel completely ordinary. Think about how many abilities in life are built quietly. Patience is rarely developed during moments of success. It is developed during waiting. Resilience is rarely formed when life is easy. It is formed when circumstances are difficult. Wisdom is rarely gained from comfort. It is gained from experience. And many of those experiences do not look impressive while they are happening. They look like everyday life. Yet those small moments slowly shape the person you become. This pattern appears clearly in the life of David. When people think of David, they usually think about the famous moment when he defeated a giant warrior. The story of David and Goliath is remembered as one of the most dramatic victories in biblical history. But that moment did not appear suddenly. It was the result of years of preparation that no one else was watching. Before David ever faced a giant on a battlefield, he was a shepherd in the fields. Day after day, he cared for sheep. To most people, that job might have seemed insignificant. It did not involve crowds. It did not involve leadership. It did not involve recognition. It was quiet, repetitive work. But during those quiet days in the fields, something important was happening. David was learning responsibility. He was learning courage. When predators attacked the flock, David did not have soldiers to help him. He had to protect the sheep himself. Scripture tells us that he fought off lions and bears. Those experiences were not public victories. No one celebrated them. No crowds applauded. But each time David faced danger, he learned something. He learned how to stay calm in the presence of fear. He learned how to trust God in moments when he stood alone. He learned how to act with courage even when the odds were against him. At the time, those experiences may have felt like nothing more than part of his job. But years later, when he stood on a battlefield facing a giant warrior that terrified an entire army, those lessons suddenly became essential. The courage he developed in private prepared him for a moment that would later define his story. Without those earlier experiences, David might have reacted very differently when that moment arrived. The same pattern appears again in the life of Joseph. Joseph once had dreams that suggested a future of influence and leadership. But the path toward that future was filled with experiences that looked nothing like success. After being betrayed by his brothers, Joseph was taken to Egypt and sold into slavery. For many people, that moment would have felt like the end of the story. Everything Joseph once believed about his future may have seemed impossible. But even in that painful situation, something important was happening. Joseph was learning how to manage responsibility. Even as a servant, he handled the duties given to him with integrity and discipline. His ability to manage small responsibilities eventually earned him trust. Later, even when he was falsely accused and placed in prison, Joseph continued showing the same character. He managed tasks. He helped others. He remained faithful in situations where most people would have given up. At the time, those experiences likely felt unfair and confusing. But each responsibility he carried in those hidden places was quietly developing the leadership ability he would later need. Years later, when Joseph suddenly found himself in a position where he was responsible for managing an entire nation's resources during a time of crisis, those lessons became essential. The leadership skills he learned in slavery and prison prepared him for a role that would eventually save countless lives. Without those earlier seasons of training, he might not have been ready. This pattern appears again and again throughout history. Many of the experiences that shape a person's future begin in environments that seem completely unrelated to their eventual calling. A skill learned in one season becomes the key to solving a problem in another. A challenge faced early in life becomes the source of strength later. A lesson learned quietly becomes wisdom that others rely on. But when people are living through those moments, they rarely see the connection immediately. They only see the present. They see the routine. They see the challenges. They see the frustrations. And because they cannot yet see how everything will connect, it becomes easy to believe that their efforts are not leading anywhere. Yet often the opposite is true. God frequently uses ordinary seasons to prepare people for extraordinary responsibilities. He builds character slowly. He shapes perspective through experience. He develops strength through challenges that may appear small at first. And because the preparation happens gradually, people sometimes underestimate its importance. They believe the real purpose of their life will begin later. They think the current season is simply something to get through. But what they do not realize is that the habits they are forming right now, the discipline they are practicing right now, and the lessons they are learning right now may become the exact tools they need for the future. The small responsibilities you carry today may be preparing you to carry greater responsibilities tomorrow. The patience you are learning right now may one day help you guide others through difficult situations. The perseverance you develop today may become the strength that allows you to continue when others around you give up. Training does not always feel dramatic. Often it feels quiet. Often it feels repetitive. But those quiet moments are where growth happens. And one day, you may suddenly find yourself facing a challenge or opportunity that feels much larger than anything you have encountered before. In that moment, you may realize something surprising. You have already been preparing for it. The lessons were already being taught. The strength was already being built. And the training that once felt ordinary will suddenly reveal itself as one of the most important seasons of your life. Because sometimes the moments that seem the least important are actually the moments where God is quietly preparing you for the future you have not yet seen. And in the next part, we will explore something even deeper. Why God sometimes allows people to go through difficult lessons, and why those painful experiences often become the very things that prepare them for their greatest responsibilities later in life. There is a type of lesson in life that no one volunteers to learn. It does not come through comfort. It does not come through success. And it certainly does not come through easy seasons. These lessons come through difficulty, through disappointment, through moments when life feels unfair. And in those seasons, people often ask one painful question: why is this happening to me? Because when we face hardship, it rarely feels like preparation. It feels like loss. It feels like failure. It feels like something has gone wrong. But one of the deepest patterns in both life and spiritual history is that many of the experiences that hurt the most are the very things that shape the strongest people. Pain has a strange ability to teach lessons that comfort never could. It changes how we see the world. It changes how we see ourselves. And sometimes it even changes how we understand faith. There are certain kinds of wisdom that only appear after a person has faced difficulty. Patience that comes from waiting through uncertainty. Compassion that grows from understanding what suffering feels like. Humility that develops after failure. Strength that forms when someone refuses to give up even after everything seems to collapse. These lessons are rarely easy, but they are often powerful. And many times, the people who eventually carry the greatest responsibility in life are the ones who have passed through the deepest valleys first. One of the clearest examples of this pattern appears again in the life of Joseph. Joseph's story is one of the most dramatic transformations in the Bible. At one point, he was a young man with dreams about leadership and influence. But those dreams quickly collided with reality. His own brothers betrayed him. They sold him into slavery. For Joseph, that moment must have felt like complete devastation. Everything familiar in his life disappeared in a single day. He was taken to a foreign land, separated from his family, placed in a situation where he had no control over his future. For many people, that kind of experience would destroy hope. It would create bitterness. It would create anger. Yet Joseph responded differently. Instead of allowing pain to define him, he chose to remain faithful and disciplined even in circumstances he did not choose. And because of that, something remarkable began to happen. The painful season that could have broken him instead began shaping him. In slavery, Joseph learned responsibility. He learned organization. He learned how to manage resources and handle authority even when the authority above him was imperfect. But his challenges were not finished. After working faithfully, Joseph was falsely accused and thrown into prison. Again, his life seemed to move backward instead of forward. Again, it would have been easy to believe that everything was pointless. Yet even inside prison, Joseph continued showing the same integrity and discipline. He managed responsibilities. He helped others. He interpreted dreams. He remained consistent even when his circumstances were deeply unfair. Those prison years must have been painful. They must have felt slow. They must have felt confusing. But those years were also teaching Joseph something powerful. They were teaching him emotional strength, leadership under pressure, wisdom about human behavior, and patience in situations where he had no control over timing. Years later, when Joseph was suddenly elevated to a position where he was responsible for managing food resources during a massive famine, every one of those painful experiences became relevant. The administrative skills he learned, the emotional resilience he developed, the wisdom he gained through hardship, all of it prepared him for that moment. Without those earlier experiences, he might not have been able to carry the weight of that responsibility. Another powerful example of painful preparation appears in the life of Peter. Peter was one of the closest followers of Jesus Christ. He witnessed miracles. He listened to teachings that would later shape the foundation of Christianity. Yet despite his devotion, Peter experienced one of the most painful personal failures recorded in Scripture. On the night Jesus was arrested, Peter promised that he would never abandon him. He declared that even if everyone else walked away, he would remain faithful. But when pressure arrived, fear took over. Peter denied even knowing Jesus. Not once, but 3 times. For someone who loved Jesus deeply, that moment must have been devastating. Imagine the guilt, the regret, the feeling of failure. Peter had believed he was stronger than that. Yet in a moment of fear, he discovered his own weakness. Many people would assume that failure would disqualify someone from future leadership. But something different happened. That painful moment transformed Peter. It humbled him. It removed the overconfidence he once carried. It taught him compassion for the weakness of others. Later, when Peter eventually became a leader in the early Christian movement, those lessons made him a different kind of leader. Not arrogant, not self-reliant, but humble, compassionate, and deeply aware of how much people need grace. His failure did not destroy his future. It prepared him for it. This reveals a powerful truth about the way God often works. Sometimes the experiences that feel like the worst moments of our lives are the very things that prepare us for our greatest responsibilities. Because pain has a way of refining people. It strips away pride. It deepens empathy. It strengthens resilience. And while those seasons are incredibly difficult to walk through, they often leave behind wisdom that no easy life could ever create. Many people who eventually guide others through hardship are the same people who once walked through darkness themselves. They understand pain. They understand fear. They understand doubt. And because of that understanding, they become capable of helping others in ways that someone who has never struggled cannot. When you look back at your own life, you may find moments that once felt pointless or painful. Moments that made you question everything. Moments that seemed to slow down your progress. But what if those moments were shaping you? What if the struggles you faced were building emotional and spiritual strength? What if the lessons you learned during those difficult seasons will eventually become the exact wisdom someone else needs to hear? Because sometimes the most painful lessons become the most valuable tools later in life. And in the next part, we will explore another surprising truth. Why God sometimes allows long seasons of waiting, and how those quiet periods often prepare people for moments that arrive suddenly and change everything. There is a season in life that almost everyone struggles with. It is not always painful like suffering. It is not always dramatic like failure. In many ways, it is even more difficult. It is the season of waiting. Waiting is uncomfortable because it feels like nothing is happening. You pray, but the answer does not come yet. You work, but the breakthrough does not appear. You prepare, but the opportunity stays out of reach. And slowly a quiet question begins to grow inside your mind. Did I misunderstand something? Because when time passes without visible progress, it becomes easy to believe that your efforts are meaningless. You begin to wonder if you are stuck, if you are forgotten, if your life has somehow drifted away from its purpose. But one of the most important truths about waiting is this. Waiting is rarely empty. Often, waiting is preparation. It is the hidden season where character is built, patience is strengthened, and faith is tested in ways that comfort never could. Throughout history, Many of the people who eventually carried great influence experienced long seasons of waiting before anything significant happened. One powerful example is the life of Moses. Most people know Moses as the man who led the Israelites out of Egypt. They imagine the dramatic moments, the confrontation with Pharaoh, the miracles, the parting of the sea. But what many people forget is how long Moses waited before any of that happened. Before Moses became a leader, he experienced failure. After trying to defend an Israelite slave, he was forced to flee Egypt. In a single moment, his life changed completely. The future he may have imagined for himself disappeared. Instead of influence and leadership, Moses found himself living in the wilderness, far away from the center of power, far away from recognition. For 40 years, Moses lived as a shepherd. 40 years. That is an entire lifetime for many people. Imagine how that must have felt. Day after day guiding sheep through desert land. Quiet days. Simple routines. Nothing that looked like preparation for leading an entire nation. From the outside, it might have appeared that Moses' life had moved backwards. But something important was happening during those years. The wilderness was shaping him. Before the wilderness, Moses had grown up in the palace of Egypt. He understood power, education, and authority. But leadership requires more than knowledge. It requires patience, humility, resilience. And those qualities are rarely learned in comfort. The wilderness taught Moses how to endure long seasons without recognition. It taught him how to navigate difficult terrain. It taught him how to guide living beings through harsh environments. Years later, when Moses eventually led the Israelites through the desert, those experiences suddenly became essential. The wilderness that once felt like isolation had quietly prepared him for leadership. But Moses is not the only example. Another powerful story of waiting appears in the life of David. Earlier we talked about David's early life as a shepherd. But even after he defeated the giant warrior and became known throughout Israel, his journey toward leadership did not happen immediately. In fact, David spent many years waiting after he had already been chosen to become king. During that time, he faced danger, uncertainty, and exile. He had moments where his life was constantly threatened. There were seasons where he had to hide in caves. Seasons where he wandered through wilderness areas trying to survive. Those years were not glamorous. They were not comfortable. They were not the kind of experiences people expect after achieving something great. Yet those waiting years shaped David's character. They taught him restraint. They taught him wisdom. They taught him how to lead people who were struggling and uncertain. Many of the psalms attributed to David were written during these difficult seasons. Songs filled with questions, emotions, and deep reflection. Those writings later became some of the most powerful expressions of faith ever recorded. Without the waiting season, that depth might never have existed. Waiting has a way of deepening people. It forces them to confront doubt. It forces them to strengthen patience. It forces them to trust even when they cannot see the full picture. And although waiting feels slow, it often prepares people for moments that arrive suddenly. Because when opportunity finally appears, it rarely gives long notice. Sometimes it comes unexpectedly. And the people who are ready in that moment are usually the ones who spent years preparing quietly beforehand. Think about how often this pattern appears in life. A musician practices alone for years before performing on a stage. An athlete trains for thousands of hours before one championship moment. A leader spends decades learning before one critical decision shapes history. The world often celebrates the moment of success. But the real work happened during the unseen years. During the practice. During the waiting. During the quiet seasons where progress felt slow. This is why waiting should never be mistaken for wasted time. Waiting can build discipline. It can develop perspective. It can strengthen faith in ways that immediate success never could. And sometimes, when people finally reach the moment they have been hoping for, they realize something surprising. If that moment had arrived earlier, they would not have been ready. They would not have had the patience, the wisdom, or the emotional strength required to carry it well. The waiting season gave them something more valuable than speed. It gave them readiness. And often, readiness is far more important than timing. Because when the right moment finally appears, the preparation done during waiting becomes the difference between someone who collapses under responsibility and someone who rises to meet it. And in the next part, we will explore another powerful truth. Why the lessons God teaches today are often meant not just for your present life, but for a future moment when someone else will need the wisdom that only your journey could create. One of the most surprising truths about the lessons God teaches is this: many of them are not only for you. At first, that idea may sound strange. When you are going through a difficult season, it feels deeply personal. The struggle is yours. The questions are yours. The pain is yours. And during those moments, it is natural to focus on survival, just trying to make it through the day, the week, or the season. But as time passes, something unexpected often happens. The very experiences that once felt private begin to gain a new purpose. They become stories. They become wisdom. They become guidance that helps someone else who is walking through a similar valley. And suddenly you realize something powerful. What you learned was never meant to stay with you alone. It was meant to flow through you. History shows that some of the most influential people were shaped by lessons that later allowed them to guide others. Their struggles gave them credibility. Their hardships gave them empathy. Their experiences gave them understanding that could not be learned from books alone. One powerful example of this is the life of Moses. Before Moses ever led the Israelites out of Egypt, he spent decades living quietly in the wilderness. During those years, he learned patience, endurance, and humility. At the time, those lessons may have seemed like nothing more than the result of his circumstances. But when Moses later stood before an entire nation of people who were frightened, uncertain, and wandering through the desert, those same lessons became essential. Leading people through hardship requires more than authority. It requires understanding. It requires emotional strength. It requires the ability to remain calm when others feel overwhelmed. Because Moses had already lived through long seasons of uncertainty, he was able to guide others through similar challenges. Another example appears in the life of Joseph. Joseph's years of betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment were incredibly painful. But those experiences eventually gave him a deep understanding of hardship and resilience. When he later rose to a position of leadership in Egypt, he did not only manage resources during a famine. He also demonstrated wisdom and mercy when dealing with the very brothers who once betrayed him. Instead of responding with revenge, Joseph chose forgiveness. And that decision did something remarkable. It preserved his family. It changed the future of an entire lineage. The lessons Joseph learned through suffering allowed him to respond with maturity when the moment arrived. Without those painful experiences, his response might have been very different. This pattern appears again in the life of Peter. Peter once experienced the deep shame of denying Jesus Christ during a moment of fear. For someone who loved Jesus deeply, that failure must have been crushing. But that painful moment transformed Peter. It humbled him. It removed the pride that once made him believe he would never fall. Later, when Peter became a leader in the early Christian community, that humility allowed him to guide others with compassion instead of judgment. He understood human weakness because he had experienced it himself. And because of that understanding, he was able to help others grow without condemning them. This reveals something important about the way wisdom develops. Real wisdom is rarely theoretical. It is experiential. It grows through moments where a person faces real choices, real consequences, and real emotions. Those experiences shape perspective in ways that simple knowledge never could. That is why many of the people who become the most effective mentors, leaders, and guides are those who have walked through difficulty themselves. They do not just know what to say. They understand what someone else is feeling. And that understanding creates trust. When someone who has suffered speaks to a person who is struggling, their words carry weight. Not because they are perfect, but because they have been there. They know the darkness. They know the doubts. They know the questions. And because they survived those moments, they can now help someone else survive them too. Think about the moments in your own life that shaped you the most. Perhaps it was a season where you felt lost. Perhaps it was a mistake that forced you to grow. Perhaps it was a challenge that required courage you did not know you had. At the time, those experiences may have felt overwhelming. You may have wondered if anything good could come from them. But later, those same experiences may have become the exact story someone else needed to hear. Maybe a friend was struggling with something similar. Maybe someone asked for advice. Maybe your words helped someone keep going when they were ready to quit. And in that moment, something beautiful happens. The pain that once seemed meaningless suddenly gains purpose. It becomes part of a larger story. A story where the lessons you learned now help someone else take their next step forward. This is why God often allows people to walk through lessons before he places them in positions where others will depend on them. Because influence requires wisdom, and wisdom often comes from experience. The struggles you face today may become the understanding that helps you guide someone tomorrow. The mistakes you learn from may become the warning that protects someone else from repeating them. The strength you develop through hardship may become the encouragement that lifts someone when they feel too weak to continue. Your journey may shape more lives than you realize. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can offer the world is not perfection. It is perspective. And that perspective is often built through the lessons God teaches long before we understand why we needed them. In the next part, we will explore something even more powerful. Why the lessons God teaches today are often preparing you for a moment in the future where everything you learned will suddenly make sense. There is a strange moment that sometimes happens later in life. It is the moment when you suddenly look back and everything connects. The struggle that once confused you, the delay that once frustrated you, the lesson that once felt unnecessary. All of it begins to form a pattern. What once felt random now feels purposeful. What once felt painful now feels meaningful. And you realize something that would have been impossible to understand earlier. God was preparing you. The truth is, most lessons in life do not make sense while they are happening. When you are inside the process, you only see the difficulty. You see the long nights. You see the uncertainty. You see the effort that does not seem to produce immediate results. But preparation often works in silence. It works slowly, and it only reveals its purpose when the moment finally arrives where those lessons are needed. Throughout history, many people experience this exact realization. One powerful example appears again in the life of Joseph. Joseph's life was filled with events that once looked like disasters. Being betrayed by his brothers, being sold into slavery, being falsely accused, being forgotten in prison. At each stage, it would have been easy to believe that his life was falling apart. But years later, when Joseph became one of the most powerful leaders in Egypt, something remarkable happened. He was placed in a position where he could save thousands of lives during a devastating famine. And eventually, the same brothers who once betrayed him came to Egypt seeking food. At that moment, Joseph finally saw the full picture. All the suffering, all the delays, all the confusion, they had not been meaningless. They had positioned him exactly where he needed to be at the exact moment when his leadership could save others. Joseph himself expressed this realization when he told his brothers that what they intended for harm had ultimately been used for good. That statement revealed a profound understanding. Sometimes the events that feel destructive in the moment are actually moving pieces of a much larger plan. Another powerful example of this realization appears in the life of David. David's early victory against the giant warrior made him famous. But fame did not immediately lead to stability. Instead, David spent years running for his life. He lived in caves. He wandered through wilderness areas. He experienced betrayal and constant danger. During those years, David wrote many of the reflections that later became part of the book of Psalms. They reveal a man wrestling with fear, faith, hope, and trust. At the time, those struggles must have felt exhausting. Yet those same experiences built the depth of character that later allowed David to lead a nation. Without the wilderness, David might have been a warrior, but the wilderness shaped him into a king. This pattern continues to appear throughout life. Often the lessons people learn during quiet or painful seasons become the exact abilities they need later. The patience learned during waiting becomes essential during leadership. The compassion developed through suffering becomes necessary when guiding others. The resilience built during hardship becomes the strength required when facing responsibility. When the moment finally arrives where those lessons are needed, everything suddenly makes sense. You understand why the process took time. You understand why certain experiences were necessary. You understand why growth had to happen slowly. And perhaps most importantly, you realize that if those lessons had not happened earlier, you would not be ready for the opportunity now in front of you. Preparation rarely feels exciting while it is happening. It often feels repetitive. It often feels slow. Sometimes it even feels unfair. But preparation creates readiness. And readiness is what allows people to handle moments that could otherwise overwhelm them. Think about the times in your life where something suddenly required skills you once struggled to learn. Perhaps it was a job where you needed knowledge you developed years earlier. Perhaps it was a relationship where you needed patience you learned through past conflict. Perhaps it was a moment where someone needed guidance that only your past experiences could provide. Those moments reveal the hidden value of preparation. They show that the lessons you once questioned were quietly building the foundation for something greater. This is why it is important not to dismiss the season you are currently in, even if it feels slow, even if it feels repetitive, even if it feels confusing. Because the lesson you are learning today may become the exact wisdom you need tomorrow. And when that moment finally arrives, you may look back and realize something extraordinary. God was not delaying your life. He was preparing you for it. There is a quiet truth about life that many people only discover years later. The seasons that shaped you the most were rarely the easy ones. They were the seasons that stretched you, the seasons that confused you, the seasons that forced you to grow in ways you never expected. At the time, those moments probably did not feel meaningful. They felt uncomfortable. They felt slow. Sometimes they even felt unfair. You may have asked questions that had no clear answers. You may have wondered why things were happening the way they were. You may have felt like your life had paused while everyone else seemed to move forward. But the deeper truth is this. Growth often happens in places that do not look like progress. Many of the most important lessons in life are learned quietly, away from recognition and applause. They are learned in moments of patience, in moments of reflection, in moments where you must keep going even though the destination is not visible yet. Throughout the stories we explored, this pattern appeared again and again. The wilderness shaped Moses before he ever stood before a nation. The betrayal and prison shaped Joseph before he was placed in a position where he could save lives during famine. The failures and waiting seasons shaped Peter before he became one of the most influential leaders of the early Christian movement. And the long years of wilderness shaped David before he ever wore a crown. None of those journeys were easy. None of those lessons came quickly. But every one of them created something powerful inside those individuals. Patience, wisdom, humility, strength. And those qualities became essential when their moment of responsibility finally arrived. This is why it is important to trust the process of growth, even when it does not make sense yet. Because sometimes God teaches lessons long before we understand why we need them. Sometimes He strengthens qualities inside us that will only become useful years later. And sometimes the experiences that feel slow or frustrating today are quietly building the foundation for a future moment where everything you learned will suddenly matter. Think about the possibility that your current season may be doing exactly that. Perhaps you are learning patience right now. Perhaps you are developing resilience. Perhaps you are gaining perspective through experiences that once felt difficult. You may not see the full picture yet, but the lesson itself is still shaping you. And one day, when a moment arrives that requires exactly the wisdom you have gained, you may realize something powerful. Nothing was wasted. Every lesson mattered. Every experience contributed to the person you became. And the journey that once felt confusing was quietly preparing you for something greater than you could see at the time. So if you are currently in a season where life feels uncertain, if you are learning lessons that feel difficult, if progress seems slower than you hoped, do not assume that nothing is happening. Sometimes the most important preparation is invisible. Sometimes the most powerful growth happens in quiet seasons. And sometimes the lesson God is teaching you today will become the exact strength you need tomorrow. So keep learning, keep growing, keep moving forward with faith, because the story is not finished yet. And the lesson you are learning right now may be preparing you for a moment in the future where everything finally makes sense.